everything after this should be live.
Good afternoon. I'm Dave Anderson, and I serve as chair of the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I asked the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Jacqueline Lightcap.
Here.
Kimberly Becker.
I don't see Kimberly on the call.
Very good. Allison Bell.
Here.
Claudia Dozier.
Here.
Linda Heitzman Powell.
Here.
Emily Kessler.
Here.
You said Pete Peterson would not be here.
That's correct.
Christy Marie Steele.
And I believe she was also going to be absent today.
And Mike Wassmer was going to be late.
That's correct.
Alice Young.
Here.
I note the following BSRB staff members are also present. David Fye.
Here.
Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or COMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of COMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the COMA. On March 22nd, 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call line is active. I did check it before the meeting, and there are no individuals on the conference call line, but I'll let you know if someone beeps over.
Thank you, Dave. All right, the meeting is now called to order, and we will start with our agenda. Did everybody have an opportunity to review the agenda? Any additions or excuse me, to the agenda that you'd like to make? If not, I'd accept a motion to approve the agenda.
Emily Kessler moves to approve the agenda.
Thank you. Second.
I'll second.
Very good. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Thank you. Next, we'll take a look at the minutes from the last meeting, which was January 9th of this year. Any additions or modifications to the minutes?
I think I was present for that. I think I did have to leave early, but my name's not on the list. So I do believe I was present for part of it.
But we will go ahead and correct that on the official copy. If that's if the person who makes the motion to approve the minutes is receptive to that modification.
Any other additions or modifications? If not, could I have a motion with the addition of Jacqueline Lycat being added to the list of people who were at that meeting? Looking for a motion to approve.
Emily Kessler moves to approve the minutes with the addition of Jacqueline Lightcamp as in attendance.
Claudia Dozier seconds. Oh, yeah, we both second.
Thank you. All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Very good, motion carries. That takes us to Dave's Executive Director's Report.
Thank you, Dave. So I will start with some agency updates in terms of operations, and then I'll go through a few legislative updates, and then we'll kind of go from there. So in terms of operations, so last year, the state of Kansas had some federal dollars related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and some of those were able to be distributed by a group called the Spark Committee. And they opened that up for individual agencies and other entities to apply for more or less grant funding for modernization and different other projects like that. So on behalf of the agency, I applied for a couple of those grant requests to allow us to do hybrid meetings more effectively after the pandemic, and to upgrade some of our technology here in the agency to also assist with that function, replacement of a projector in the board conference room. And so they went ahead and took those submissions last year, and then they opened up a different process back in January. And so we resubmitted for those two projects, and we were approved for funding. So the total award for the two projects was a little over $2,000, but with that funding, we were able to purchase an OWL camera for the board conference room. If you're familiar with those, they're really helpful, especially when you're trying to do things like hybrid meetings, because the camera essentially sits in the middle of a table and can get everyone around the table, and we have a way we can hook it up to the Zoom meetings. So that's going to be really helpful as we move forward and have more hybrid meetings or in-person meetings where we want to make it accessible to people by broadcasting it too. So really happy about that. And then the projector, both of those items were installed by the Office of Information Technology Services last week. So we're going to be using them going forward, but really appreciative of IT support in terms of installing that information, and also that funding being made available. And so it saved a little bit of money for our licensees. In terms of some legislative updates, the legislative session just ended last week. It was a very busy legislative session. As you might recall, all agencies have to submit a budget, revised budget for the legislature, and have that approved by both the House and the Senate. And this year we submitted a revised budget. We try to take into account things like increased cost for some of the individual agencies we work with, such as the agency that hosts our license system, and also the individuals who provide legal services to the agency, and some other vendors like that. And so we submitted a budget. The governor made a recommendation on expenditures, and then it was considered separately by both the House and the Senate. The Senate went ahead and recommended what the governor had recommended for all years. The House recommended the amounts that the governor had recommended, but added a proviso that I may have described a little earlier. But since your last advisory committee meeting was in January, I thought I'd kind of walk through a couple of those items. The proviso the House added when it was in the House Higher Education Budget Committee would add language to the agency's budget for fiscal year 24 and 25, which would prevent the BSRB from adopting or imposing, as a condition of obtaining or renewing licenses or permits, any incentives or requirements that applicants for licensure or permit undergo, demonstrate familiarity with, or support any training, education, or instruction program that includes diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, critical race theory, or other related topics. And that language noted it did not apply to equal opportunity or equal employment opportunity materials designed to inform individuals about the prohibition on discrimination based on a protected class status under state and federal law. That language is directly from the proviso they added, but essentially what happened was when I went before the House Higher Education Budget Committee, they asked questions about a bill that the BSRB had requested introduction of. So separately, you have budget committees, and then you also have policy committees that consider bills. The budget committee was asking questions about the bill that was going to go before the policy committees. And one of the items the board had recommended in the policy bill would have added a new requirement for all licensees to have 3 continuing education hours every license period in the area of cultural diversity. It was part of an overall board recommendation to decrease the number of continuing education hours in diagnosis and treatment from the levels of licensure that were able to do that, down from 6 hours to 3 hours, and then add that new 3-hour requirement in cultural diversity. So when the budget committee was considering the budget, they asked questions about the bill and asked questions about that new continuing education proposed requirement in the bill. And they added this language. And I think the intent or the effect of this language would have been, if that information would have passed in bill, it would have basically prevented us from enforcing that new continuing education requirement separately from the bill passing itself. And so, this proviso language was added by the House and the Budget Committee. It went to the House Appropriations Committee. They had a discussion whether to keep it on or not. Ultimately, they decided to keep it on. And so that was part of the House's version of the budget bill. And then the House passed their budget bill, the Senate passed their budget bill. You go to an area called Conference Committee, where the House and the Senate come together and resolve items of difference. And when they were doing that, they decided ultimately to go with the House position on this item. So the budget bill that was passed by the legislature, which was House Bill 2184, included this language for the BSRB in that budget bill. And then that bill was passed right before the legislature took their traditional 2-week break. And then the reason they take that 2-week break is to allow the governor to review all the bills that had passed by that point. The governor has the opportunity to veto any of those bills, sign them into law, or do nothing. And if she does nothing, eventually they will become law. But for the appropriations bill, the governor has a little different authority than some of the other bills. For the appropriations bill, the governor can do line item vetoes, and she can veto certain sections of the bill if it's an appropriations bill. And so when the governor was reviewing House Bill 2184, the governor went ahead and line item vetoed this new proviso language that had been added by the legislature for the BSRB. When the legislature came back last week, they had the opportunity to consider overriding governor vetoes. And so based on where we were in the bill, section 15, we were the first override that was considered by the House. And when the House voted, they attempted to override the veto, and on a vote count, they failed in the override attempt by 1 vote. So the proviso language is vetoed by the governor, and it did not stay on the agency's budget for the next 2 fiscal years. But I kind of wanted to walk through that process because it was a little complicated. It did not come back when the legislature passed a separate omnibus appropriations bill, but I just kind of wanted you to know sort of the history of that item. It was a little confusing, and there have been some questions about it, but since the governor did veto it out of the bill and that veto override failed, it's no longer on the agency's budget for the next 2 years. So I think I'll pause here and just ask if you have any questions over the budget or over that proviso. I know that there were some questions from other committees, and I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions about it if you have questions about it.
So that's a continuing education requirement?
It is not. It was a proposed continuing education requirement that was going to be in the bill. And I'll talk about the bill here coming up. But when the bill went through the process, that item was removed. So since it was removed from the version of the bill that moved forward, I don't want to say it was a moot point, but the budget proviso would have prevented us from enforcing it if that item would have stayed in the bill. But with that item being removed from the bill, I think the effect of the language would have prevented us from being able to revisit it unless there was other language that would have made us not withstand that proviso. So I think the intent was to say, even if it did pass in the bill, we wouldn't be able to enforce it. But since that item was taken out of the bill, the effect of it was a little unclear by the end of the process.
Gotcha. So essentially nothing changed.
For right now, I believe nothing changed. So a lot of conversation to get to that point, but wanted you to know, because I think there have been some articles too that have talked about it a little bit. I know it's kind of confusing, but ultimately for that item, there's no change to the continuing education requirements. And it could have potentially tied our hands into the future if it would have stayed on, but now it's been vetoed. So it's off the agency's budget for the next couple of years. But I think maybe it would be helpful if I talked about the BSRB bill. That might put this all in context. So the agency did, and all of you worked very hard as an advisory committee, and the board really focused on a lot of trying to solve issues and make things better last year. And the work of the advisory committees, a lot of recommendations were forwarded to the board for review and consideration. The board spent a lot of time looking at the existing statutes and trying to figure out if there are ways to help with workforce especially, and also, of course, the board's mission to protect the public. And so ultimately, those recommendations by the board were culminated and put forward before the legislature in a bill, and that was House Bill 2340. And House Bill 2340 was heard by the House Health and Human Services Committee. There were a number of items in that bill. Some of those items stayed in the bill after it was heard by the House Health and Human Services Committee. Some of those items were taken out for your age, for your profession itself. One of the items that the board had added for their bill was to add a board member for the behavior analyst profession. That would have been a 13th board member. It would have been put in statutes. The governor would have appointed a board member for behavior analysis. There was also language that would have added some disciplinary remedies. Right now in statute, the language for disciplinary remedies is a bit different for behavior analysts versus other professions. For other professions, it includes a list of different items that if someone violates unprofessional conduct, you could do things like issue a fine, a public censure, you could suspend their license or do conditions such as supervision, you could revoke the license. For the behavior analyst profession right now, the statutory framework says that if someone commits a violation, you could suspend their license or revoke their license, but all of the other disciplinary remedies are absent. And so if there's a minor violation, it puts the board in an awkward position to either not being able to take action at a small level or having to take an extreme action. And so the language for the disciplinary remedies was put into the bill to make it more consistent with the other professions. And then there was language we talked about at the very beginning of the year. That was a board recommendation to add language to be able to reinstate behavior analyst licenses. That language was also missing from the statutes. And so in the past, if a behavior analyst had a license that expired, they would have to reapply and essentially get a new number. But for the other professions, if their license has expired, they're able to reinstate the license. And so one of the items on the agenda kind of deals with that topic. But that was an item that the board had put forward in the bill for your profession as well. And so there were a number of other items that were specific to reciprocity statutes for some of the other professions, lowering the amount of time for someone to qualify for licensure under reciprocity. For most of the professions, one of the statutes said you either had to come from a jurisdiction with substantially equivalent license requirements or have practiced for 48 of the last 54 months and then met other requirements. That 48th month requirement was the board recommended lowering that from 48 months down to 12 months and made other recommended changes, such as to allow individuals with temporary licenses to be able to practice under those for 2 years instead of 1 year to make those consistent, and to allow more time for individuals if they're struggling to pass the licensure examination. There was language added in the bill that would have added an exception for individuals if they were coming to the end of their license period and there was an extreme situation that prevented them from getting all of their CE hours before the deadline. They were able to submit for additional time to finish those hours. They would still, if they were approved, they would need to renew their license on time, but they would get an additional time up to 3 months to be able to finish those hours if there was something like a health emergency or something extreme of that nature. There was also some language that was focused on trying to help people who previously were licensed be able to reinstate their licenses more easy and come back to the professions. If someone had been out of the profession by at least a year, It would have decreased the cost for them to come back and reinstate their license by half. And it would have added a new 6-month temporary reinstatement license so that if they didn't have all of the CE hours they needed to fully reinstate their license, they could pursue that short-term 6-month reinstatement license, be able to work while they're finishing those hours. Then once they have them, they can fully reinstate their license. There was also some items that were specific to the social work profession to be able to provide a new type of temporary license for candidates who come from schools that are in candidacy for accreditation. It was based on the time it takes for individuals to make it through that process, or the programs themselves. It can take 3 to 3.5 years. So you could have individuals who come from programs that are seeking accreditation and are on their way, but they're not accredited yet. And so this helps the agency be able to give a temporary license to those individuals. And then once they become, or their programs become accredited, then they can get a permanent license. There's also an item the board worked on to establish sort of a pipeline for the addiction counseling profession. And that is a new student temporary addiction counselor license. And these would be for individuals who are taking coursework to become an addiction counselor. They have about 60 hours in addiction related courses or related field. And they have an agreement set up between the school and the potential employer that would be able to provide supervision for them and have an arrangement for them to be able to work under that new student temporary license while they're finishing their coursework. And so the board got really creative and put forward a lot of really good ideas to address workforce and some other measures too. And there's more items in the bill, but I just wanted to highlight some of those. When the bill went before the House Health and Human Services Committee, 3 items were removed from the bill. The first, as we talked about, was the board recommendation to have a new 3-hour requirement in the area of cultural diversity. The legislature, at least the House Health and Human Services Committee, made a motion to remove that item from the bill. So that item was removed. There is currently a 6-hour requirement for individuals who are able to diagnose and treat, that they get 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment every 2-year license period. And as part of the new 3-hour cultural diversity requirement, the board was going to lower the 3 hours of diagnosis and treatment. And so the legislature removed the cultural diversity piece, but also wanted to lower the amount of hours in diagnosis and treatment down from 6 hours to 3. So that would begin as of 2025. So that was one piece. Additionally, the board had recommended a new requirement for the social work profession to have board approved supervisors. The legislative committee removed that item from the bill, so that board approved supervisors for social work item that was removed as well. And then the House Health and Human Services Committee also removed the item that would have added the board member for the behavior analyst profession. So those 3 items were removed by the committee. The committee did add 3 items, and the 3 items that the committee added, one would be to make modifications to the statute for individuals wishing to become a clinical social worker. Right now, there's about 15 hours in statute that are specified that someone has to complete as part of their education to become a clinical social worker. They're related to the area of diagnosis and treatment. The committee struck 4 of the 5 of those classes. So the coursework requirement that was in statute was lowered from 15 hours in that area down to 3. Additionally, there was some language in that about the clinical social workers that involved a clinical practicum and also talked about the 3,000 hours of postgraduate supervised experience, including 1,500 hours in diagnosis and treatment. And the legislature, the House committee changed the language on that. Instead of requiring 1,500 hours doing diagnosis and treatment, the new language says 1,500 hours, including but not limited to diagnosis and treatment. So it does change the criteria there quite a bit. We're still looking into whether there's ways the board could clarify a little bit more of those 1,500 hours, how many of the hours do need to be diagnosis and treatment, but that's something that we'll still be looking at for a little while. Another item that was added by the House Health and Human Services Committee was some operating changes for the BSRB. You might recall there was a reciprocity bill that passed a couple of years ago that required agencies that were licensing military members and military spouses to have to review those and issue licenses by a certain time frame for some of those military members and other individuals who qualified under the statute. Similarly, one of the items that was added by the House Health and Human Services Committee would have required a new operating process for the BSRB. So within 15 days of receiving an application or permit, we would need to send a message to applicants, letting them know if they have a complete file, and if they don't, what items are missing. And then once we have a complete file, we would need to issue a decision within 30 days. And the language also required us to implement and create an expedited license review process that would be separate from the first things I talked about. This expedited process would essentially say that someone could pay a fee, and if they paid this special fee, they would be able to get a decision within 15 days. But that process still needs to be developed by the BSRB, and so determining what's going to go into that policy is something we'll be working on. And then the third item that was added by the House is the creation of a new community-based license. This is something that would be for the professions of licensed psychology, the bachelor's and master's level of social work, marriage and family therapy at the non-clinical level, and then professional counseling at the non-clinical level. And what this new type of license would be, it's very similar to the existing traditional temporary license. It would be for individuals who have met the educational qualifications for licensure, for those level of licensure, that have not passed the licensing examination yet. And for those individuals, they would need to be working under the scope of employment. The original language said under the scope of employment at a community mental health center and under supervision by someone at a clinical level. As that item worked through the process by the legislature, it was amended in conference committee. And so now it is available for individuals who are also in the scope of employment for a federally qualified health center, FQHCs, individuals who are under the scope of employment at a psychiatric residential treatment facility, PRTFs, or there's some other alcohol and drug facilities that are listed in statute. And the item of concern, I think, in that item that has the new community-based licenses is that currently for our temporary licenses, there is language that when you are describing yourself by using an initial or a title, you have to use the designation that it's a temporary license. And that's to make sure that individuals know that it's not a permanent license and you still have some things to do to get a full permanent license. Under this new language for those community-based licenses, it specifically says that for those level of licensure, you can use the initials and the title, and it does not say you have to use the temporary designation. But the language in the statute for these new community-based licenses would be that they would last no longer than 24 months, could not be renewed, which is the new standard for the traditional temporary licenses. So it's a little bit confusing, but I talked to the board in the last full board meeting and explained these items, and there were several board members who had concerns about that new community-based license because the danger that it could pose in terms of individuals thinking that those license holders would have a permanent license when their license is more of a temporary nature. And so I did, when the bill passed the House, it did pass the House floor, went over to the Senate committee. The Senate committee, I went ahead and met with the different members of the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. I scheduled meetings with every single member of that committee, and some of them before and after the hearing, and described the issues with the bill, some of the concerns the board had regarding some of the amendments the House added to the bill, and requested certain amendments, and I put those in my testimony as well. At the hearing, there were a number of people who were testifying on the bill, so I had 2 minutes to talk to those items, but I did my best to kind of relay the information about how the positive items in the bill were helpful, but that the board had concerns about the items that were added by the House committee. When the Senate was working the bill, they did not remove any of the items that we had requested amendments for. They kept those in the bill. And as I mentioned, the Senate did pass it out of committee. They did not pass it on the floor. So ultimately, the bill was combined in conference committee. And so the bill itself now is included in Senate Bill 131. So it was originally House Bill 2340, and now the contents are included in Senate Bill 131. Ultimately, what happened was they took the contents, modified them a little further in conference committee, and then when they went for their 2-week break, it had not run across the House or the Senate floor. When they came back from the break, they did go ahead and run that bill across each chamber's floors as one of the last items they did. So it has now passed the legislature, and it is on its way to the governor for review. And the governor has the option to veto it. The governor could approve it, but it's been packaged with at least one, if not two other bills that have a similar health relation. And so right now we're waiting to see if the governor will enact the bill or if the governor will veto the bill. If the bill is enacted, then we will be working to implement a lot of those provisions that the board had put forward. And so it's been a long process this year. They've been over at the Capitol for several meetings, both with the House members and both with the Senate members, just to make sure that the board's concerns were communicated, to request additional changes. But it's been a long process. And right now we're just waiting to see if the bill will be enacted, and if it will, then we'll make sure that those items are put in. And so I'll go ahead and pause here and see if you have any questions about the items in the bill.
I do.
Okay.
I do as well.
I'm on the website. Which one of these documents do I open so I can read that, Bill?
Good question. So on the legislature's website, what they do is they start with one version of the bill, and then as it goes through the process and gets amended, they will publish new versions of it. So you will usually see amended by the House committee or amended by the House floor. When a bill is bundled with other bills, it's included in something called the Conference Committee Report, a CCR. And so you actually have to go down a little further on the page to find the CCR and then the description, which is called the CCRB, or the Conference Committee Report Brief. So you want to pull up the CCR. And
Okay.
They also had a copy of the Senate bill that you just mentioned, where it's like all together on that same page, Linda. It's at the very bottom.
Yeah. So you want under the CCR for 131, and it's a little hard to read because ultimately what will happen now is they will take that language, put it all together so it will look more like a bill, and then that's what the governor will get to review.
Is it the one dated April 6th?
That could be. So they voted on, I believe, last Wednesday. Well, so it's probably not April 6th. They voted on the Conference Committee report last Wednesday, but they did combine it before they left. But there should be one line that says the CCR and the CCRB. So whichever line is the CCR, it would be on that line.
They're both on the same line.
Okay.
So David, just to clarify, they did take out the provision that that this committee had asked for about adding a behavior analyst to the board. Do we have a rationale on why? I submitted testimony for the House bill on asking them to add that back in again. Do we have a rationale why they took that out?
They didn't really describe that when they made the motion. I did get some questions about it, so I can only kind of guess based on the questions that I was asked in committee. They did ask if, I think one of the questions was asking if, it sounded like if there were too many board members or something like that. And I did say that I thought, since there is not a member for that profession, that it would be helpful to have someone who could speak to the public protection items involved with the profession. I also was asked a question if they should add more board members for the social work profession, given how many licensees they have. And I informed them that we're not an advocacy group. We're here for public protection. And so it's really not proportional based on licensees. And we already have 2 social work board members on the board, but that's why we were asking for the behavior analyst. So. Yeah,
because doesn't behavior analysis have a couple hundred or more and no representation on the board now?
I believe that there's, if you account the assistant behavior analyst and the behavior analyst, I think there's close to about 400, maybe 350 to 400 now.
So that's got to be a pretty big percentage. I mean, that's not being represented at all. So I'm pretty disappointed that didn't get put back in. I know there's nothing you can do about it, but just for the group. it's scary for us, especially as behavior analysts. Behavior analysis is already pretty misunderstood in the general psychology group, that there's not one on there. So
Yeah, and I did see some testimony that was submitted on the Senate side, and I think that was a really good idea. It's been my experience that when something is removed from a bill, it's very difficult to get it back into the bill. And like I said, they gave us a total of 2 minutes per person to talk about everything in the bill. So I decided to divide my time with about a minute for the good things that were in the bill, because ultimately, we wanted the bill to pass to make sure that there were improvements that the board had recommended, and then to describe the items of concern that were in the bill. But I would have definitely appreciated a lot more time to advocate for some of the board's original positions, including the behavior analyst position.
I think the thing that I'm most disappointed about is that there's not a rationale. Like, they didn't give us a reason why they took it out. They just took it out. So.
And that, certainly understand your frustration there. I think Dave has explained to the full board in the past that when we create what we send to them, it's ours, but once we send it to them, it's theirs. And they make these changes without ever asking us if those, obviously we put a lot of time and effort and use the advisory committees for helping us craft that. And so it's a frustrating process. We have talked about a workaround. You all right if I talk about that, Dave?
Sure, I think that'd be fine.
So there is an opening coming up in the licensed psychologist representatives to the board. They have 2 representatives. And one of your members is someone who could fill that position, and in that position become the chair of this group. And so we did talk to Linda about that to see if she would be interested. So it was an attempt on our part to kind of get what everybody believes is important. Just because they closed one door doesn't mean we might not be able to find another way around to get you a representative on the full board.
And just to kind of clarify that process too, that I do get questions on board membership from time to time. In my role, I don't have a vote in board appointee process, but I do my best to coordinate that. There's an office of appointments in the governor's office, and that office is the office that reviews applicants and works with the governor. Officially, the governor does appoint new members to the board, but I'm always happy to help coordinate individuals who are interested in that. But Dave's right. We looked at it before. The statute that names board members does not name a specific behavior analyst. But if there was someone else who had a license that was identified there and was a behavior analyst, that would be something that would definitely be able to give a voice to this profession on the board, to be able to speak to the unique aspects of the profession. So
it's a lot of pressure, Linda.
That's what I was thinking, Claudia. It's a lot of pressure. And I went out and I looked at it, and it's like this whole process. So I just went through and I filled it out today.
Yay.
I'm like, you have to know who your district, it was not what I was expecting. I had to declare my political affiliation. Yeah. So it was interesting, but I did get it submitted. We'll see what they say.
Linda, you're the perfect person to do this.
Thank
Agreed.
you, Alice. Thanks, Claudia.
Other questions about Dave's report? And Dave, thank you very much. It was a very detailed report, and I know you worked really, really hard up at the Capitol.
well, and I'll just
Yeah, that's definitely what I was thinking, David, is that all of the work that's been put in by your group and all of these different advisory boards, that it had to be a little bit devastating when all this came back. And so we appreciate everything that you've done in your role.
well,
I
thank you.
agree. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
And this group probably doesn't know the answer. But like these people that are on this Health and Human Services Committee that are making these decisions, those are elected positions, right? And so we have no guarantee that anybody that's on those committees has any experience with what we do or what any of the other professions do. Is that correct?
So on the House, those are all representatives, and the Senate, those are all senators, and they all have been elected to those positions. And then I believe House leadership and Senate leadership determines which members are on which committee. But in terms of their backgrounds, they have a pretty diverse background based on the individuals. And so there may be individuals, I know that there's a member of the House committee who is a social worker, but I think it's pretty rare. And I think there's definitely a member of the Senate committee who has an MD, so he is a doctor. But I would say most members of both committees don't have a background in health. I think it would be, at least as a licensee, I should qualify that, because some of them may have some background working in different areas involving health, but that's kind of been my experience in working with them. Now, some of them have served on those committees for a number of years, and so they do have years of experience hearing from different groups and different topics, but the different backgrounds for all those individuals.
So that means you guys, everybody on this call, we have to go out and run for office. So that means
or lobby the folks that are in office.
Well, and I appreciate the compliments that you gave concerning the work that I did this year. I'm happy to do that, and I do take a personal investment in a lot of the work that I do, and I do my best to represent the board and the advisory committees in terms of the comments that they bring forward. And so we all want to make sure we're helping people. I think there's just some differences in terms of what individuals and different groups think is the best way to help people. But I will advocate as much as I can. And when it comes down to spending time, I will dedicate my time to be doing this, whether it's meeting with people out of committees or during committees. But, as Dave mentioned, sometimes our hands are tied on these things and it's outside of our control. So we do take a big personal investment, and we're definitely invested in this. But ultimately, there's a lot of other people that are involved in the process. So we just do the best we can. And then once the dust settles, we keep moving forward and keep trying to make positive changes. I did want to make a couple of comments about some bills that are related to the BSRB that I want to touch upon, because I find those to be a little interesting. One is that we did join a new multi-state compact. As a composite board, the BSRB does oversee 7 professions. There was a bill, House Bill 2288, for the professional counseling profession, and there is a multi-state compact for the clinical level of that profession. So we did join that. The infrastructure for that compact is still being developed, so it will take some time for us to start to issue those privileges to practice under the compact. But that is
what states are they, Dave?
That's a good question. I believe that there are at least 17 states that have joined the compact now.
Wow.
There's enough. Initially, the first year, I think there were 2 states. So that wasn't enough to actually have the commission meet. I think it was maybe Maryland and Georgia. But then this last year, there were enough where they could start to have commission meetings and start to work on development of just some of their policies and rules and things. And then this year, Kansas is now part of the compact. So they're still working as a commission before they can really get it all set up. But there are definitely enough now where it could be running once the infrastructure is in place. But I have to keep you updated as that kind of gets functional.
Does that mean that they agree on what all of the rules and regulations are, and that there's reciprocity across all those states?
Kind of. So there's different models for compacts. So let's say for the nursing compact, they have something where states can issue a single state license or a multi-state license. And so under that compact for nursing, you could, if you are in a member state part of the compact, you could get a license in, let's say, Kansas, or you could get a multi-state license, which will allow you to practice in Kansas and also any other states that are part of the compact. For the professional counselor one, what they use is a privilege to practice model. And so what you'd be able to do is once everything is set up, you would be able to say, I would like to practice in this state that is part of the compact. And so you could apply to the commission to get a privilege to practice in that state. So it would be a little bit different than a traditional license, but it would allow you to practice just as if you had a license in that state. You would still be required to follow their rules and be knowledgeable about what scope of practice they do allow. But the compact would essentially establish a standard that all those states would have to meet for their licensees. And then it would essentially, it's almost like a license, but it would be able to expedite that process. So you can practice in any of those that you got a privilege to practice in. So Kansas did become a member of that. We're still working on the infrastructure. And then I did want to let you know too, the social work profession has been working on draft language for a compact as well. And that draft language was finalized at the end of February. And so that has been released now, but based on how late in the process it was released, I don't think any states are probably going to pass it this year. I think it was introduced in bill form in about 8 states, but it's too late in the year for that to get passed. In Kansas, I would imagine someone might offer it up for a bill next year, but that is something where they have finalized the language, and that model is a multi-state license type model. So if the compact was all functional and going, you would be able to get a license under that social work compact if it passed in Kansas, and then you could alternatively get a multi-state license and then practice in other jurisdictions or states that were part of that compact. And so
David, I'm licensed in Kansas as a psychologist, and I'm also licensed in Alaska.
Mhm.
And so, and this is, you may not know this answer. So currently I pay the fees to both states separately to maintain that license and the CEs that are required. So having this compact, does that mean there's going to be an additional fee on top of the individual state fees in order to be able to get a multi-state license?
for social work,
No, for anybody who participates in these compacts, because eventually we're going to be looking at the behavior analyst license, especially for us here close to the Missouri line. So
yeah, it's
how does that work in practice?
it's a fair question. It's a complicated answer. So
Okay.
we also are a member now of SciPac, which is a multi-state compact for licensed psychologists, the PhD level of psychology. And essentially that is a limited multi-state compact. And so it's set up uniquely as well compared to the other 2 compacts. It's run by the SciPac Commission, and with the SciPac, you have to have a permanent license in your home state, and that home state has to be a member state in the SciPac compact. I think there's now 37 states, and so most states are now part of SciPac, but you have to have an active permanent license in your home state, and then you can apply to the SciPac Commission for something called an e-passport. And then once you get approved and they review you for that, you can apply to either get something called a right to do telehealth services in other compact states, or you could alternatively apply for something that would give you the right to do up to 30 days of in-state practice in those states. And those are on an annual basis. And the money for those things through the SciPac Commission does not come back to Kansas. And so essentially when SciPac was going through, there was concern that individuals from out of state who currently have a Kansas license, if Kansas joins that compact, then they may not have, do a license in Kansas anymore. So Kansas would be losing out on that license revenue because it would be going to the SciPac Commission instead. And also the SciPac Commission is set up so that they look back at everyone in their home state, and they actually charge the state of Kansas an assessment of $10 per person who has a home state license that's practicing under SciPac. So they have a way to charge, and the BSRB is the entity that pays that. So the BSRB pays that on behalf of all the individuals practicing under SciPac even though the money going to the commission goes to the commission and not the BSRB. So one of the items they did to try to make up some of that lost revenue was to allow the BSRB to do a fee for individuals who are practicing in Kansas under that compact with their home state license. And so it's a fee of $25, which allows us to recoup some of that assessment cost that SIPAC is charging us, plus some of the money that we're losing out on because of individuals practicing under SIPAC instead of having a license. So I understand this is kind of deep into the weeds, but just hopefully this illustrates some of the differences between compacts, that they strive to have uniform standards for people to be in the compacts, but the compacts are set up a little differently. And so it just kind of comes down to how each compact is set up.
And so just one more question, and then I'll quit talking about these compacts. So would this subcommittee be the one that would entertain the notion of exploring other surrounding states' interest in becoming part of a behavior analytic interstate compact?
Well, you might want to reach out to the Council for State Governments, CSG.
Mhm.
They have been an active player in terms of drafting some of the compacts. It seems like some of them have been pushed for by the Department of Defense, and then the Council for State Governments has been one of the major contributor in terms of, I think they have a division specifically for interstate compacts. And so they had a list of professions that they were focusing on. And the list that I saw, I have not seen behavior analysis on there. But then again, I haven't seen draft language for a marriage and family therapy compact or an addiction counselor compact. So I know that there's more professions out there where there may be interest, but they're kind of working their way through some of these compacts.
So once we get the language, our current charge, which is to make sure that our implementation of our current legislation is where we want it to be, would that be something that this committee would be talked about within this committee? Or
we could explore that. I don't think there would be anything wrong with maybe requesting someone come and talk to the committee to see if there's been any development with that. Now, if there hasn't been any development, maybe they would just issue a letter to us or something like that. But we could definitely reach out to see if there's been any conversations about that. To my knowledge, I haven't heard of any, but I'd be happy to kind of research that and reach out to CSG.
I haven't heard any for behavior analysis either.
I haven't either. So does anybody else have any input on whether we want to ask David to do more work for us? Or if we just want to put it on, maybe on the agenda and revisit it closer to the end of the year to give him a chance to come up?
Might be a good idea to reach out to like Gina Green or someone else to see like where this is, if it's even being considered in the field, and sort of the pros and cons of it before we do anything about moving forward.
Are we allowed to do that? I guess we can do it as an individual without referencing subcommittee membership. Is that correct, David?
Yeah, you're allowed to explore any of these topics on your own. Just make sure that you don't, loop in a majority of the members of the advisory committee, whether it's in person or by phone or by email. If any individual members want to explore this, that's perfectly fine. But you just want to make sure it's not members of the group working together on something outside of the meeting. So
feel free to reference yourself as the Kansas grassroots, Linda, if you do. Great.
Will do.
All right. That moves us to old business.
Can I ask a quick question before we move?
Sure.
So just kind of going back to the adding someone to the board, which the legislature denied. I think it's great that we have a workaround here, but just kind of thinking about long term, like what is the way to get that back in the legislation? Is that just like wait for another year or two, or what is that like?
I assume that would be a part of BSRB's legislative proposals moving forward, but to Dave's point, that's a very political process. So when you were asking about, are these decisions being made by people with a background, in any kind of helping profession, let alone yours specifically, the answer is no. Who they're listening to and what those people are saying, again, to Dave's point, is we don't know, and they're not often going to tell us. I talked to a person I know who's a lobbyist, and he said, part of it is some of these guys just don't want to add to government. They don't want things getting bigger. They just don't like that. And some said it was, well, right size the board, and then they would think about it. And so when the board started, with psychologists and social workers, that's why there are 2 each of them. None of the other groups have more than 1 person, regardless of the number of people who hold those licenses. So I would assume it will be part of our recommendations going forward. And it would be very helpful then to reach out to your representatives, to your senators, and talk about why they should support that. Because if they're not hearing from us, they're just listening to whoever they are hearing from.
Alice, it's something that we were talking about as part of the legislative committee of Kansas as well. So it's something that they've brought up that they are also going to start working on. So.
And so do we know if it's that we can do it each year, or is it on a cycle, or is it an annual cycle, twice every other year cycle?
So in Kansas, the legislature meets every spring. Some states only have a legislative session every other year, but in Kansas every spring. So now it may come down to if the board is requesting legislation, and I know people wear different hats based on membership in different groups, but this committee, the main function of the advisory committee is to consider recommendations from the board and forward recommendations to the board under the role of being an advisory committee for the BSRB. So ultimately for this committee, the recommendation could be to forward it again to the board. And then it would be up to the board in terms of if they requested legislation on behalf of the BSRB. But any group can come to a legislative committee and talk to the chair of the committee to request introduction of a bill. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a state agency that would request something. Some of those committees may allow individuals or groups to submit bill requests. Some of them may say, we allow bill requests, but they have to be through a member of the committee. So it could be advocating by, talking to a member of the committee and saying, will you request a bill introduction on our behalf? So for the BSRB's purpose, that's what we have done sometimes. Sometimes, this year for the Senate, they allowed me to come before the Senate committee and request introduction of the bill directly. For the House, they requested that I talk to a member of the committee, and then the member of the committee did the bill introduction on our behalf. So it just kind of comes down to what different committees allow. But in terms of the role of the BSRB, it would be what the board would recommend, that the board would request legislation. And if they would, then I would go over there and advocate on their behalf.
Thank you for that information.
Anyone else? All right, we'll move on to old business. Finalizing recommended changes to unprofessional conduct regulations.
Okay, and I realize it's been several months since we have worked through these, but last year we did a comprehensive review of the unprofessional conduct regulations for each of the professions. Your advisory committee had a lot of really good discussions about changes to those unprofessional conduct regulations. And at our last meeting in January, we reviewed some of those potential changes and made it almost all the way through the list. So I wanted to go ahead and share an Excel sheet that we had looked at last time and go through the last items that at least I had pulled out as items to have a discussion on if there was any potential change. And then if you had any other thoughts, we could add them to this list. Ultimately, the goal is to make sure that our regulations are up to date. And if there are positive changes to submit, we could submit these on behalf of the advisory committee to the board for their review and consideration. It doesn't mean we can never revisit these, but some of these unprofessional conduct regulations had not been updated in quite a few years. And so I'll go ahead and share my screen and just kind of, we can go through the remaining items on that Excel sheet. Okay. Okay, so you should be seeing the Excel sheet here. And this list on the left, the current language of the unprofessional conduct regulation. And then on the right, some comments that I had noted based on previous discussion. And so I believe last time we had gone through a list and we had gone down to, I believe, item AA or item BB. So let's go ahead and start with item AA. In the unprofessional conduct regulations, essentially it says any of the following would constitute unprofessional conduct by a licensee. And so under AA, it said soliciting or assuming professional responsibility for any clients of another agency or colleague without attempting to coordinate the continued provision of client services by that agency or colleague. And I think one of the noted possible changes was possibly adding language when entering a relationship with a third party, failure to clarify the nature of the relationship with each party and assess any potential conflicts. So I thought I would revisit that and see if you had any additional thoughts or if you thought that would be a positive change to go ahead and implement.
So Claudia, I know it's been a while. Do you remember what you were thinking there? Because if you, like the language that you're suggesting, seems like it might fit better under row 10, MM. No, that's specifically supervising. Never
Yeah,
mind.
that's supervising.
about-
This is about switching clients.
Right. How about, because it seems to me the intent of AA is not so much a conflict. Engaging in, is this the one where when we were talking about it, we were thinking that there might be, that would be added in as another qualifier? Instead of having it replace AA, that it would become its own line? I don't remember. Because wouldn't the intent of AA, so let's say that we had a client that was going to shift from Allison to me. And, part of it could be because they moved from South Kansas to North Kansas. And so the current AA seems to me that I would reach out to Allison and say, do you have a way to continue to serve this client up here? Or would you like to transition their services? Right? Is that what it says?
It appears to me, and a lot of this is, if someone believes these have been violated, it would go before a subset of the board, the complaint review committee, and they would weigh all the different information. So, so a lot of this might come down to a fact pattern for an individual case, but it looks like the item in AA is talking about essentially, it appears to be taking someone else's clients. Soliciting or assuming professional responsibility for any clients of another agency or colleague without attempting to coordinate the continued provision of client services by that agency or colleague. So, so part of it is taking over someone's clients without making sure that there is a continued provision to make sure that that person receives services.
Yeah, so I don't think I was suggesting any change from this. I was just suggesting that based on what was in the Missouri one and stuff that was in the BACB documents to add after AA,
Yeah.
that it's on the right.
That's what I was sort of kind of remembering, but
Okay, so this would be a new item.
Yes.
So it would-
yeah.
Okay. I'll put this down as,
But I do feel like AA is kind of confusing. Just like what exactly, so it's not okay if someone like relocates and then I'm becoming their provider. Is because soliciting, meaning that I know someone is someone's client and I'm like, okay, you need to come with me and become my client. But assuming it's like, if someone comes to me, I do not feel there's any problem for me to take it over. Yeah, this is,
I think the issue is if there's still an ongoing client of the first
Correct.
person.
Correct.
And so now you have a patient with two providers who may not know about one another. The second person, which is why we always generally ask people, making sure they're not in services with somebody else. And if they are, making sure that what we're doing is different than what the other person is doing for them. I think that's, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's what that's trying to distinguish.
So Alice, I think it would be like, remember, we've had a couple of families come through here that are getting EIBI from another agency, but they wanted parent training. And so we coordinated with the other agency and the insurance company.
yes.
Yeah. So I don't think that would fall under AA. I think what would fall under AA is, well, number one, soliciting, like going out there and, you know, having somebody hand out flyers as people come out of the building, would be soliciting. But also if we were doing parent training without trying to coordinate with the other agency or insurance company, is that what that means?
and I think some of this is probably open to some different interpretations.
Yeah, because what if they don't tell us? What if somebody comes to Allison and says, Allison, can you do parent training with me? And they don't tell Allison about their services with somebody else. And Allison says, sure, I'd love to do parent training with you. And then boom, she's hit with a disciplinary action because she assumed professional responsibility without coordinating with the other agency.
I think though we don't want this to have like room for interpretation though. That's like the point
Yeah.
of this conversation. Yeah, David?
Yeah, if we can make this less vague, that would be beneficial. So
Cool.
yeah, if we can change this language to make it better, that is definitely something that would be positive.
Maybe adding, I don't know why that would fix the problem, adding knowingly soliciting or
So here's the thing. I'm going back and looking at all of the documents. So this particular, so just as a reminder to everybody, our ethics, our unprofessional conduct document was derived from other professions. And so in the review of each of these, we went and looked back to see, is anything about this in the BACB ethics code? Is anything about this in the Missouri unprofessional conduct? So there's nothing in the BACB that talks about this. There's nothing in the Missouri. Let me see, AA. Section 7H. So like I was just leaving it alone because but the important aspect of it, the important thing is that what is in Missouri on professional conduct and what is mentioned by the BACB is when entering a relationship with a third party. And so all I was suggesting here is not touching AA. Now, if you guys want to change it, that's fine. Not touching AA, but adding in relevant information that is not in this unprofessional conduct that sort of has to do with this. So if you just want to delete AA, that's fine. But I do think what's on the right about when entering in a relationship with a third party needs to be in our unprofessional conduct. Does that make sense?
Maybe
Yeah.
replace that with the new one that you proposed.
Okay. So the new language here would be a separate item. Is there support for making sure that we add this new language here within the quotes?
Yeah.
Or maybe replace that, just like get rid of the original AA.
Can I? No, I cannot. I was gonna put some stuff in the chat because if I think the solicitation, you know, we are bound by the BACB against solicitation. So I put like actively soliciting clients of another agency or colleague without attempting to coordinate the continued provision of client services by that agency, blah, 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 blah. So if we split it out, then it would be, the second line would be something like assuming professional responsibility for any client or another agency or colleague without attempting to coordinate services for continuity of care. Because for me, that's where the ambiguity in AA comes from, is that one is continuity of care and the other one is active solicitation.
Okay. And any other members of the advisory committee? Does that sound like something that would be helpful to go ahead and split those two out as was described?
Works for me.
Okay. And so Linda, could you say that again?
Yeah, I just like for AA put actively and then getting rid of or assuming professional responsibility. That goes into the second line. That's part 2.
Okay. Might be complicated, but make it work.
And then, yeah, just paste it there for a minute.
Okay.
So that would be part 1. Part 2 would be assuming, would be the first word. Professional responsibility for any clients or another, for any clients of another agency or colleague without attempting to coordinate services for continuity of care.
What do you think about that? Essentially splitting AA into 2 different items and then adding the new language here.
Mhm.
I'll go ahead and highlight these so I can come back to them on the final version.
What do you guys think?
Works for me.
Good.
All right, thumbs up.
And yeah, we can't really see everyone on screen. So if you do have objections, just raise them. If you don't have objections, we'll just take it as consensus from the group. Okay, well, let's move forward. Item BB, making claims of professional superiority that one cannot substantiate. And then Claudia, I think this might have been another one to add after BB. failure to actively engage in professional development activities to maintain and further their professional competence.
Agreed.
Mhm.
So this would be a new item. Is there any objection to adding this as a new item?
Mhm.
Sounds like there is consensus to go ahead and add it.
Yes.
All right, in MM, currently the language says when supervising, failing to provide accurate and current information, timely evaluations, and constructive consultation. And then the new language would say taking on more supervisees and trainees than allows for effective supervision.
Yeah, so that would be an additional one after MM.
Any objections to adding that as a new item? Okay. Sounds like there is consensus on that.
Yep.
And then here, there were additional possible items when supervising and training, failing to incorporate and address topics related to diversity.
My only, I think that's great, especially because the legislators took out the diversity, the DEI language for continuing ed. But how would we enforce that? How would we know that?
And the only way that these would probably come up is if someone filed a complaint.
Right, so someone filed a complaint and then there would be an investigation. And I'm fine with not including it, but these are things that are mentioned in the new BACB ethics code
Mhm.
and or were included in the Missouri unprofessional conduct. So that's why I also suggested these are additional ones you could also add on.
Yeah, I think they're all great. I think that 1 and 2, number 3 is like just a suggestion, like change it to be a supervisory and training section. I think that's just a comment, right, Claudia?
Yeah, I don't want to do that. Like, we've been doing this for months now. I don't think we need to go there. Like, so I definitely think number 2 should be added
Yep.
as after MM. But I mean, I don't know what folks think about with respect to the diversity thing. I do think that would be difficult to investigate.
Should I just delete this language here under 3?
Yeah.
Sure.
And I think probably for number 2, it's probably missing a negative in there somewhere. Because it should say something like when supervising and training, delegating.
Failing to.
Yeah, or delegating tasks to supervisees and trainees that are not competent to perform the task or something like that.
That
Or-
works.
Yeah, or failing to delegate tasks to supervisees and trainees on tasks for which they demonstrate competence. Well, how they get, well, never mind, because they can't demonstrate competence without being able to at least attempt the task.
Only delegating tasks to supervisors and trainees that are competent to perform the tasks.
Does that work, David?
So adding the word only.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Very succinct and to the point, Claudia.
So the point that you're going after with adding the word only. So what would how would this be interpreted then?
That the tasks that you delegate to supervisors and trainees are only ones that they're competent to perform.
But the way they're currently worded is it would say the following are unprofessional conduct.
Mm.
And it sounds like that would be something you have appropriate.
failure to only delegate tasks to supervisees and trainees that are competent to perform the task. I don't know.
Mhm.
For which they are competent to perform.
No, so now that failure to delegate, if you're
Oh.
going to use that, there needs to be an only in there, because the point being here is that you want to only delegate tasks to people for which they're competent to engage in. So I can't remember what the beginning of this is, because it's like 900 letters above, but
How about, let's take a look at this. Delegating tasks to supervising trainees.
ensure something like failing to ensure that supervisees and trainees are competent to perform the tasks delegated to them, or something like that.
I like that.
Okay. So failing to ensure. Failing to ensure that supervisees and trainees are competent to perform delegated tasks.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
All right. Any objection to adding that as a new item?
Nope.
Okay, let's go ahead and say that is the consensus. Okay. And then there were two last items here. One is there was a separate regulation for record keeping, unprofessional conduct and record keeping. And a lot of the advisory committees had recommended moving that into their main unprofessional conduct regulations, so that if someone was trying to find anything that would be an issue, they could go to one instead of two. By the way, Mike Wasmer is entering the meeting now too, so he is present. And then the second one for that unprofessional conduct regarding record keeping, there was a highlighted item from the language in the Missouri requirement that basically would say for each person professionally supervised, behavior analyst shall maintain for a period of not less than 5 years after the last date of supervision, a record of the supervisory session that shall include the type, place, and general content of the session, as well as other information required by these rules, other law, or good practice. So I guess the question is that language that you would like to see similarly included in the Kansas version of that item?
Claudia, does that fit with the BACB's guidelines?
I don't know. I didn't do record keeping. I wasn't assigned to record keeping.
Oh. Let's see.
I think Alice did record keeping, right?
Yeah,
Are we looking at, I'm so sorry, line 11?
13.
Oh, 13, okay. Yeah, so I think the language in the Missouri one sounds good to add.
Mhm.
And there will have to be some artistic liberty here, because the unprofessional conduct regulation was worded as, here are certain requirements that you should follow. And the unprofessional conduct regulation is basically, don't do the following items, or the following would constitute unprofessional conduct. So we'll have to reword some of that from the record keeping regulation, but sounds like there may be consensus to go ahead and add a version of this language concerning the time period for records.
Works for me.
Okay, then we will go ahead and include those items as well. So, but I did want to thank everyone for their very hard work and all the time that you spent going through and reviewing all those unprofessional conduct regulations. I know it was a big task last year, and I think it will be helpful. Additionally, I've been reminding different groups last year, the legislature did pass a bill that essentially has us as an agency go through all of our regulations for all the professions by 2026 to state whether those regulations are necessary for the implementation of state law, or if not, to repeal them. And so if we can show that we're being timely in reviewing these and making changes so that they're not outdated, I think we're definitely staying ahead of the curve and making sure we're being responsible as a state agency. So wanted to thank you all for your work on that.
Thank you. That moves us to item B, continued discussion on possible regulation for care of clients in crisis.
Hmm.
And I know we have talked about this item previously.
Mhm.
In the minutes, the summary of the discussion was that the advisory committee would recommend language for practitioners to have a written plan with resources for clients. And then I believe some of the advisory committee members were going to review ABA guidelines to help develop language on the topic further. So I just wanted to revisit this. I know it's been several months since the last time we met, so I didn't know if you had any additional comments on this. If not, we can go ahead and forward what you had to the board. But if you do have additional thoughts, we can go ahead and modify some language to forward to the board. And then ultimately the board will probably have a conversation and try to have some consistent language if possible.
I'm curious too, in regard to the ethics code for behavior analysts, how you see the facilitating continuity of services section of that, which is 3.14 applying. And if you want, I can read that.
Yeah.
Behavior analysts act in the best interest of the client to avoid interruption or disruption of services. They make appropriate and timely efforts to facilitate the continuation of behavioral services in the event of planned interruptions, such as relocation, temporary leave of absence, and unplanned interruptions like illness, funding disruption, parent request, emergencies. They ensure that service agreements or contracts include a general plan of action for service interruptions. When a service interruption occurs, they communicate to all relevant parties the steps being taken to facilitate continuity of services. Behavior analysts document all actions taken in this circumstance and the eventual outcomes. That's 3.14.
So that's referring to if there's anything with the behavior analyst that happens that they can no longer continue to provide services. So if they become ill, if there's a lack in funding, if they have a leave of absence for whatever reason, is what that's getting at.
Yeah, I didn't know what one parent requests references or emergencies references.
I think the emergencies is on the side of the behavior analyst. Like if they have an emergency, if parent request is that parent requests that their child be served by another behavior analyst.
I feel like this is a very setting specific problem. Again, I know that we have talked about this in the past, but I just know that some people working in certain agencies like residential program and things like that, they definitely have those emergency plans. They are probably going to be on call and things like that. But for the outpatient services that we provide at IKU Medical Center, we we really don't have that kind of, we talk about like, behaviors and how you should address it, but we really don't have that, parents at midnight calling us to ask for suggestions. We really don't have that. I don't think that's only true for behavior analysis. It's also true for the psychologists as well. So I guess that's the hard part about this.
Agreed. There's not some blanket thing you write that would take care of all contexts and situations in which behavior analysts work. So in my early intensive child program, kids come to us from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., right? And they get 40 hours of intensive behavioral services as if they're going to a preschool or an intensive learning environment. And so any emergencies that happen outside of, just like if I were a preschool, they don't call me, right? They have other outside people. Versus my adult services program that I have doc students at, that we provide consultation, in every single one of their behavior plans that they have, that they engage in severe instances of behavior and they are living in a residential group home or similar setting, within the context of the plan, there's a crisis management system written in specific for that individual. So I agree with Alice. There's not sort of just a blanket thing, and it depends upon the context and who you're serving and those kind of things. I don't know, maybe I'm missing the big picture.
Well, again, from the perspective of the BSRB, which is, its main purpose is to protect clients. And for the situation is, so in what situation, if a complaint was made by somebody who said, my person receiving services from this provider was in crisis, and I want to know if they should have responded to me.
Is there some language from other disciplines that can be shared and kind of giving us some like starting points or like help us brainstorm?
Is like the default thinking here is just that anybody who provides any type of psychological services is responsible 24/7 for someone in crisis. Because, so for example, in our child development center, and as part of the intake paperwork, we write in there that our responsibility is to your child when they are with us from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., right? And so it's very clear that we are not a 24/7 crisis hotline, or that's part of this type of service that we provide. So if they want that, they would have to seek out some other type of professional to provide that outside of that 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. time. So, yeah, I don't know.
So Alice, to your question, the answer is kind of yes, because mostly the services being provided by those folks are very similar, not necessarily where, but the types of services. And so there is an expectation that you or you've made arrangements with someone to be available to people who are in crisis.
But wouldn't that, I mean, that's, from my perspective, somewhat unrealistic that we have an individual service provider out in Western Kansas that is willing to put the time, energy, and effort in to be able to serve 6 families that have kids with autism, and that they have to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because there's nobody else around. It seems more ethical to me that they have a behavior intervention plan in place. Especially if the child has extreme behaviors, and that it says, if you are unable to contact me, call 911, or here's a, or if it's an adolescent, if they're talking about self-harm, call the 988 number for suicide prevention, or that they have a list of resources to do, or to draw from. Because most of us don't work for large healthcare systems or CMHCs or, any of those, outpatient clinics. That a lot of us are independent service providers.
And these expectations would be the same regardless of.
Correct. And what I'm saying is, I think that's an unrealistic.
Which is the issue. Like,
Yeah.
it's different. It's differently done if we're providing services to someone who lives in a residential program 24/7, and there are staff that can implement the behavior support plan that have crisis management procedures in there. Or if they can't, then there's a detailed list of who they need to call to intervene. But if you're providing like preschool age early intensive behavioral intervention programs, that's not the service you're providing.
And schools would be in that same category. They provide a service during that school time. And outside of school, it would be your local mental health or 911 or something. Schools would not necessarily have that 24-hour service either.
However, if it was a therapist working in a school system who was licensed as a social worker, psychologist, counselor, they would be held to that standard.
I have not heard that be brought up yet, but I definitely could see where that would be. If that's the same standard, then schools would need to come together with their BCBAs, social workers, psychologists, and develop a plan together.
Yeah, because that's not happening for any of the professions you listed.
I have not heard it happening in schools as of right now. Not saying it's not. I'm not in every school, but I have not heard of it yet.
And I mean, I felt like it's not even happening in, I'm just using KU Medical Center as an example. The psychologists work there. They are just like us. They are like, having those appointments, they're done. And then when the parents call out of the hours, the message they are going to hear is that, so please, if you have an emergency, please call 911, go to the emergency.
And what I'm saying to you is, if a parent then made a complaint against that person, that's probably not an adequate plan in the eyes of the Behavioral Science Regulatory Board. Which is why we're bringing it to all the advisory groups.
Well, I don't have any suggestions unless we see like some examples of what this might look like, given that we provide services in such different environments, like within our field, it would be different for every single environment. Like, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around what would be some blanket thing that everybody would do, something that's so vague that everybody would be able to do it.
Hey,
So
Mike,
I think we need some examples, because I don't think anybody here is really understanding what you're wanting from us.
right. Mike,
Mm-hmm.
do you know of anything like that? You've probably stuck a toe in every single state in the United States.
Not that I can think of offhand, but I can do some digging.
Would you be willing to do that, Mike?
Sure.
Thank you. There's got to be somebody out there in these 50 wonderful states that has some kind of sample and something maybe that's not institutionalized, right? We're not like Kennedy Krieger or Heartspring or, Monroe Meyer or any of those.
I was going to say, I know when I was at Heartspring that we did have a BCBA that was on call 24/7. Like, if there wasn't one on campus, there was one, but we were a residential facility and we did have like responsibility for those tiny humans.
Yeah, it's the same thing with our adult services. We're a residential program, so we have responsibility for people's care 24/7.
So I guess I'm asking, like, this is already in place for other disciplines and we're trying to put it in place. I guess I missed that piece. What was the original like prompt for this? No
So-
one.
Well, no, I think some of this came up at the board meeting originally, because I think there was a request to have some clarifying language on this topic in terms of with the rollout of 988, what were practitioners' responsibilities, and would it be sufficient to refer them just to 911 or 988 if they're having a client that has a crisis after hours. And as part of it too, there was also there was a request for clarity in terms of volunteering certain entities to provide services for your clients. If you didn't have a specific arrangement worked out with that group of providers. And I think part of that was to try to make sure that certain entities are not overly taxed and that everybody's able to receive care in a good way. But I think another part of that's become part of the conversation from other advisory committees has been wanting to make sure that when people are meeting with clients, that the clients have an adequate understanding of what resources are available to them should they encounter that down the road. So part of it is making sure something good is in place, and part of it is at the beginning, making sure they know what resources are available to.
So in
Oh, sorry,
This-
go ahead, Connie.
So I'm trying to search for the word. In theory, this seems awesome, but I think this is a cart before the horse situation, where ultimately, if states and cities had funding, they would have mobile crisis response units that could go and respond to those kind of things, or they would have entities that provided that kind of services. Most cities and states don't have that. Do you know what I mean? So like, who's going to be doing that? Like, what are people writing in and who's going to be doing it?
I also think that this is a perfect example of why there needs to be a behavior analyst on the board as well, in addition. So I'm just gonna.
Well, and I think some of the advisory, I don't have any standard language that I can show you from other groups. I do think some of the advisory committees talked about, is this something that they could adjust their unprofessional conduct regulations in the realm of continuity of care? You know, is there something that they could add under this for making sure that, you know, there is available services or there is a connection to ensure that people have adequate continuity of care, but not everybody's addressing it that way. So, but it sounds like Mike was going to be looking into this a little bit. And I'd be happy to kind of review sort of some of the minutes from the other advisory committees to see if they have some good statements. I know that some of them did add a few items to their unprofessional conduct regulations in this area. So maybe that would be something to bring back and would be helpful.
That would be great.
That would be very helpful.
All right, in the 15 minutes that we have left, let's move on to new business. Discussion of adding new members, Dave?
Yes, so this is kind of goes back about a year ago. I was doing a major project with each of the advisory committees and trying to find how long individuals had served on advisory committees, because the advisory committee policy does say that advisory committee members can serve 2-year terms and up to 4 terms. So basically a maximum amount of time of 8 years on the advisory committees. And for some of the time period before my time, the terms kind of blended together. And so we were trying to make sure that if there were individuals up for reappointments, we made sure that those went before, or if there were individuals that were coming upon the end of their terms, that would be something too we would look at. And one item when it came to the behavior analyst profession was, you had been a group that was created in statute, and there were some initial meetings to work on certain things involving the statutes and regulations, but we're an advisory committee that had not met continuously since the time period that you were first originally created. But about a year ago, I went to the board and I said, you know, how should we look at this time period, you know, and what's the standard we should be using to make sure we're consistent? And the direction I received was, basically, we should start from the initial start date. And even if the advisory committee has not met regularly, you should really start from that date and let the time period run. And so about a year ago, I had a conversation with the board, and then I came back to the advisory committee and mentioned it as well, that ultimately, when that 8 years had run, certain individuals would have to come off the advisory committee because that would be the end of their terms. And so for your advisory committee, a couple of years ago, you appointed some new members. And so those members are coming upon the end of a term as of June 2023. And that was Allison, Emily, Christine, and Alice. The other members of the advisory committee, Kimberly, Claudia, Linda, Pete, and Mike, your service essentially started during 2015 or during that time period. And so using that as a starting period, essentially this would be your last term on the advisory committee. And so it would end at the end of June 2023. So the five of you would need to come off the advisory committee. And so the advisory committee policy states that for non-board members on the advisory committee, you should have a minimum of 3, and there are currently 4 other members who can be reappointed, and there should be a maximum of 10. And so with the 5 members coming off the advisory committee, I would encourage the advisory committee perhaps to send out a message to licensees to see if individuals are interested in serving on the advisory committee. And then maybe we could schedule a quick meeting in June, which would give you the opportunity to review the letters of interest and resumes of applicants, and then make recommendations to the board for appointments to the advisory committee. So a lot of the other ones have been doing that this spring, but based on how many legislative meetings happened, we had to cancel the earlier meeting that was scheduled for your advisory committee. But I think if you wanted to go ahead and give me direction on that today, I could go ahead and send that out and then give everyone about 10 days or so to submit materials, collect it, and then send it all to you so that you could discuss it at your next meeting in June.
So is our next meeting in June going to be in person and we have cake and coffee?
Well, we could
Sorry,
certainly,
Claudia.
we could certainly have an in-person,
Okay.
or at least a hybrid meeting. We have that functionality now to make that a lot easier. And I know you all have not met in person, at least since I have been here. So if you were open to that, I would buy cake and coffee for everybody. So.
I would say I'll bring cake. So
And Dave, we talked about maybe adding 3 people, and then the following year adding a couple more just to create a staggered so that not everybody's coming off, you know, don't lose all your experience at once.
Yep. Good idea.
I think that would be helpful. I know losing the 5 members that have to come off the advisory committee is a big loss. You guys have been great members of the advisory committee and very helpful. Appreciate all the work that you have done. And this is definitely not your last meeting because we still have the meeting in June, but I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that because I didn't want to catch you off guard at the June meeting, but also to let you know that it would be a good idea to add, as Dave mentioned, 3. That would give you an odd number, which is always better for things like quorum. And so.
So do we just like have them reach out to you?
Yeah, so what I've done in the past is I put together a message, and then one of my clerical staff members sends out a message to all licensees. And then it basically explains the advisory committee. It has a copy of the advisory committee policy. And it says, if you're interested in serving on the advisory committee, send a resume/CV and a letter of interest to me. And then it gives a deadline, and then I collect all those. And then once I collect those, as we're about maybe a week or 2 before your next meeting, I'll send those all to you to review. And then at the next meeting, according to the advisory committee policy, what it states is that advisory committee members will review materials and discuss who they would recommend be added to the advisory committee. The ultimate authority for appointments is the chair of the board. So if you reach recommendations the next meeting, I can summarize those in a letter to the chair of the board and then give it to Mary Jones. And then she'll have the opportunity to request additional input if she wants, or otherwise she would just go ahead and appoint people, most likely at that July board meeting.
Okay.
I have a question.
Sounds good.
So it's open to any licensee, including assistant behavior analysts?
That is how it's been for the other professions. In fact, the advisory committee policy says it is helpful to have representation in a lot of different areas. One is levels of licensure. So it would be open to assistant behavior analysts too.
Okay.
Well, we got a
I
few
think
minutes
it's a good idea to have people across the, at different levels. I'm just speaking, maybe this is selfishly doing so, but just to throw it out there, I think it is a good idea to have one person who's a faculty person in behavior analysis.
I was getting ready to say that we also probably need to have at least one representative from like insurance and someone from like rural Kansas. And
Yeah.
so as soon as the letter goes out, David, it should come to me because I'm a licensee. Yeah. Can I post that elsewhere, like in Kansas grassroots? Because I could tag many a person in there
Sure.
of like, hi, send the letter.
That
Here
would
you
be
go.
fun. Yeah, and I know in some of these areas, we always talk about making sure that you're doing right by conflict of interest, but I know it's not uncommon when we have people submit requests for consideration as advisory committee members that it wouldn't surprise me that some of the individuals who apply, and as long as you think that the information that about them that would be helpful if they could be a good member of the advisory committee, that doesn't necessarily preclude anybody from voting to recommend them. But the recommendations or the votes on that are usually done during the advisory committee meeting. So the discussion is public and the vote of the advisory committee is public. So, but if you want to share it with anybody else, feel free. The letter that will go out and then the advisory committee policy itself talks about different things to factor into the decision too, because it talks about having representation of licensure, representation as far as geographic and other factors too, to make sure that there is diversity between members of the advisory committee. So.
Regulation on reinstating licenses.
So one of the items that is currently in the bill, Senate Bill 131, would allow us to put in, so the behavior analyst statutes are still a little different from the other professions, and we've worked on that this year to try to make them more consistent with the other professions. But essentially the statute, if the bill is passed and it goes into effect, it would authorize the BSRB to put in some regulatory language to allow for the reinstating of certain licenses that had expired. But we will still need to have a regulation that kind of outlines the process for doing that. So I can bring you, or I can send to you a little in advance of the next meeting, some potential language, which is very similar to what the other professions have. But you can tweak that if you want to, but ultimately that would what we would be submitting to the board for their consideration. And so I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of that would be coming for your review. So.
Very good. Discussion on advisory committee topics for 2023. Were those general issues you were interested if the advisory committee had, Dave, or was it more specific?
Would that be like the reciprocity we were talking about earlier?
That's actually listed as the next item, item D.
Oh.
But yeah, there you go. I wanted to leave this open in case anyone had some additional items they wanted us to focus on this year. For some of the other advisory committees, we just opened it up and allowed them if there were things that, for example, looking into possible conversations on the compacts. That could be something that we could be looking at as an advisory committee this year. But just kind of want to leave this as an open conversation. If people had items they wanted to focus on, this would be a good opportunity to kind of talk about those.
And then finally, reciprocity issue.
Yeah, and so there is a path to reciprocity for some people based on the passage of that military bill that passed a couple of years ago. But that doesn't apply to everyone. Essentially what the bill says is if you are someone who qualifies for licensure under that reciprocity bill, which would be military members, military spouses, individuals that reside in Kansas, or individuals that intend to reside in Kansas, if you are applying for reciprocity, the state would apply the existing reciprocity statute. And if the state did not have a reciprocity statute, then you would look at the factors that were in the bill, which looked at having a similar scope of practice and practicing for a certain amount of time and having a lack of disciplinary issues and things like that. And so With the behavior analyst, there's currently not a reciprocity statute for the profession. So if individuals qualify under that bill, we would be able to look at reciprocity through that for those group of people. But that does not include individuals who live out of state that are not intending to reside in the state of Kansas. And so if you did want to have a reciprocity statute, that is something that we could work on developing this year. That could be something for a bill the board could request introduction of next year. So as a to-do item, that is something we talked about just briefly in the fall, but given that it could be a complex conversation, just wanted to add it to the list of items to work on this year.
I think that's a good idea. We're home to, you know, several military installations. I think that would be good to visit.
Okay, that takes us to the next meeting, and Dave, I assume you'll send out a doodle poll on that.
Yeah, and I might send I'll send a poll with some available dates and see. As a general idea, I know we kind of joked about having an in-person meeting with cake and coffee, but is there interest in some individuals meeting in person? All of our meetings, if we have them in person, are here in Topeka. So that is something we could facilitate if individuals were interested, and then individuals who wanted to do it remotely could do it by hybrid. But
I'm willing to go to Topeka, but can it just not be the week of the 14th? Is my only request. I will drive any other time.
I'm also out of town that week, so that works.
okay, well, I will send out some available dates, and I'll just try to reach out to you all as well to see if there's any interest in doing an in-person or a hybrid type meeting. So,
Okay.
and then we can just select the date that has the fewest number of conflicts.
Very good. All right, I would accept a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
Great. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you all for your time today.
All
Have a
right.
good
Thanks,
week.
everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Oh.